You know Disney's Mulan, the girl with perfect hair who finds her true self and gets the guy. Tonight we're throwing all of that out and diving into the brutal reality of what life was actually like for a woman masquerading as a soldier in 6th century China, where discovery didn't mean embarrassment, it meant execution. We're diving into what life was really like for HUA MULAN. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You came into the world in what is now northern China, probably around 480 CE, during the Northern Wei dynasty when the country was ruled by the Tuoba clan, descendants of nomadic peoples who had conquered much of northern China and were in the process of becoming thoroughly Chinese themselves. Your father, Hua Hu, was a career military officer in the imperial army, a man who had fought in campaigns against rival kingdoms and earned both respect and a modest estate for his service. Your family lived in a military compound outside the capital of Pingcheng, in a world where loyalty to the emperor was demonstrated through generations of military service. The Tuoba rulers valued military families like yours because you represented a bridge between their nomadic heritage and Chinese administrative traditions. Your father spoke both Chinese and the Tuoba language, understood both mounted warfare and siege tactics, and moved comfortably between military camps and civilian bureaucracy. From your earliest memories, your world was shaped by the rhythms of military life. Your father would disappear for months on campaign, returning with stories of battles fought in distant provinces, new territories conquered, rebellion suppressed. Your mother, Hua Shi, managed the household during his absences, overseeing servants, maintaining correspondence with other military families, and ensuring that the family's reputation remained intact even when its head was fighting wars hundreds of miles away. You learned early that being a daughter in a military family meant understanding warfare, even though you would never be allowed to practice it. You knew the names of famous generals, could recite the tactical principles that had won famous battles, and understood the logistics of moving armies across difficult terrain. This knowledge was considered appropriate for a girl from your background because it demonstrated your family's military heritage, but it was also carefully circumscribed. You were expected to admire military virtues without ever expressing them yourself. Your education was more extensive than most girls received, partly because military families valued literacy, and partly because your parents hoped to arrange a marriage into another military family where such accomplishments would be appreciated. You learned to read and write Chinese characters, to compose poetry in classical styles, and to manage the complex accounting required to run a household that might need to support itself during long military deployments. But you also learned things that were less conventional for girls of your time and social position. Your father, perhaps influenced by his own nomadic heritage, believed that all family members should understand basic military skills. He taught you to ride horses, to assess terrain from a strategic perspective, and to recognize the signs that indicated an area had been recently occupied by military forces. A military family must always be prepared, he would say during these informal lessons. Wars create confusion, and confusion creates danger for civilians who don't understand how armies move. This practical education would prove more useful than anyone anticipated. The Northern Wei dynasty was a fascinating experiment in cultural synthesis that most people today know nothing about. The Tuoba rulers had conquered northern China through superior cavalry and military organisation, but they faced the eternal problem of nomadic conquerors, how to rule settled agricultural populations without losing their own military effectiveness. Their solution was to become selectively Chinese while maintaining their martial traditions. The imperial court spoke Chinese, used Chinese administrative methods, and patronized Chinese art and literature. But the army remained fundamentally nomadic in its organization, leadership, and tactical approach. This created a society where military families like yours existed in a unique cultural space, Chinese in daily life, nomadic in professional identity. Your father embodied this duality perfectly. At home, he practiced Chinese customs, honoured Chinese ancestors, and expected his family to behave according to Chinese social conventions. But when he spoke about military matters, he used Tuoba terminology, referenced nomadic tactical principles, and described warfare in ways that reflected the mounted combat traditions of the steppes. This cultural complexity affected your upbringing in ways that would prove crucial later. You learned Chinese feminine virtues, modesty, obedience, domestic skills, and artistic accomplishments. But you also absorbed nomadic attitudes toward women that were considerably more flexible. Among the Tuoba, women could own property, participate in important family decisions, and occasionally even lead military units during emergencies. The result was that you grew up with conflicting models of what women could be and do. Chinese tradition said that women should be invisible, passive, and completely subordinate to male authority. Tuoba tradition said that women should be capable, resourceful, and ready to defend their families when necessary. Your parents navigated this contradiction by emphasizing different aspects of your education depending on the social context. When Chinese officials visited, you demonstrated perfect Chinese feminine behavior, serving tea silently, keeping your eyes downcast and making yourself as unobtrusive as possible. When Tuoba military colleagues came to dinner, you were allowed to participate in conversations about strategy, politics, and current military campaigns. This dual education created internal tensions that you didn't fully understand at the time. You excelled at Chinese feminine arts, but found them unsatisfying. You were fascinated by military strategy, but knew that expressing this interest too openly would be socially inappropriate. You wanted to honour your family's traditions, but weren't sure which traditions you were supposed to prioritise. The Northern Wei court was struggling with similar contradictions on a much larger scale. Emperor Xiaowen was in the process of implementing radical reforms designed to make the Tuoba more Chinese, requiring court officials to wear Chinese dress, speak Chinese exclusively, and adopt Chinese names. But these reforms were creating tensions within the military, where many officers felt that becoming too Chinese would weaken the martial virtues that had made conquest possible in the first place. Your family was caught in the middle of these cultural cross-currents. Your father's career required him to demonstrate loyalty to Chinese administrative reforms while maintaining the military effectiveness that made him valuable to the empire. You were expected to embody Chinese feminine ideals while being prepared for the practical realities of life in a military family that might face sudden changes in fortune. By the time you reached 16, the question of your marriage had become a central preoccupation of your family's strategic planning. In 6th century China, marriages weren't romantic partnerships, but political and economic alliances that affected the status, security, and prosperity of entire extended families. Your parents faced a complex set of considerations in arranging your marriage. As the daughter of a successful military officer, you were an attractive prospect for families seeking connections to the imperial army. But your family's Tuoba background also limited your options, since some Chinese families still considered military families of nomadic origin to be slightly suspect despite their service to the empire. The ideal match would be another military family of similar rank and cultural background, Chinese enough to maintain social respectability, but Tuoba enough to understand the unique demands of military life. Your parents spent months investigating potential candidates, exchanging letters with matchmakers, and conducting the delicate negotiations required to arrange a union that would benefit both families. The process was exhausting for everyone involved, but especially for you. You were expected to be simultaneously visible and invisible, attractive enough to draw suitors, but modest enough to demonstrate proper feminine virtue. You had to demonstrate accomplishments that proved your education without revealing interests that might be considered inappropriate. You had to be interesting enough to engage potential husbands in conversation without expressing opinions that challenged masculine authority. The matchmaker assigned to your case was a professional negotiator named Madame Liu, whose reputation was built on her ability to arrange successful marriages between military families. She approached your situation with the systematic thoroughness of a general planning a campaign. Your daughter has many advantages, she told your parents during her initial assessment. She is educated, attractive, and comes from a family with an excellent military reputation. But she also has distinctive qualities that will require careful presentation. By distinctive qualities, Madame Liu meant that you asked too many questions, expressed too many opinions, and showed too much interest in topics that potential husbands might find intimidating. Her solution was an intensive training program designed to suppress these tendencies in favour of more conventional feminine behaviour. For 6 months, you practiced the art of being appealing without being challenging. You learned to ask questions that encouraged men to display their knowledge without revealing the extent of your own. You practiced expressing admiration for masculine accomplishments without suggesting that you might be capable of similar achievements. You mastered the delicate skill of participating in conversations about military strategy while making it clear that your interest was purely theoretical. The training was successful in the sense that it generated several serious marriage proposals, but it was also psychologically exhausting because it required you to constantly monitor and suppress your natural intellectual curiosity. The most promising prospect was a young officer named Wei Zhong, whose family had served the Northern Wei dynasty for 3 generations, and who seemed genuinely interested in your educated opinions about poetry and literature. The negotiations proceeded smoothly until they reached the question of your dowry and your expected role in his household. Wei Zhong's family wanted assurances that you would focus exclusively on domestic responsibilities after marriage, avoiding any involvement in activities they considered inappropriate for women. Your family, meanwhile, wanted guarantees that your education and accomplishments would be valued rather than suppressed. The negotiations stalled over these fundamental questions about what kind of wife you would be allowed to become. While your family was navigating the complexities of marriage arrangements, larger historical forces were creating the crisis that would reshape your life entirely. The Northern Wei dynasty was facing its most serious military challenge since the original conquest. A coalition of southern kingdoms had united under the leadership of the Liang dynasty and was mounting a coordinated invasion of northern territories. This wasn't the kind of border skirmish that could be handled by garrison troops and local militias. It was a full-scale war that threatened the survival of the dynasty itself. The enemy coalition had spent years preparing, gathering intelligence about Northern Wei military organisation, and developing strategies specifically designed to neutralise the cavalry advantages that had made Tuoba forces so effective. Emperor Xuanwu responded by ordering the most comprehensive military mobilisation in the dynasty's history. Every prefecture was required to provide soldiers according to strict quotas based on population and resources. Every military family was expected to contribute according to their ability to serve. The conscription edict that reached your family was both expected and devastating. Your father, now in his 50s and suffering from chronic injuries sustained in previous campaigns, was too old for active field service, but the family's military obligations remained unchanged. Someone had to answer the call, and the only eligible male in your household was your younger brother, who was barely 14 and had never been away from home for more than a few days. Your father spent sleepless nights wrestling with impossible choices. He could report for duty himself, knowing that his age and physical limitations would make him a liability to his unit and virtually guarantee his death in combat. He could send your brother, knowing that a 14-year-old boy would be equally unlikely to survive the rigours of campaign life. Or he could face the disgrace of failing to meet his family's military obligations, which would destroy the reputation built over decades of faithful service. Chinese military law was inflexible on the subject of family obligations. Each family owed the state military service proportional to their capacity to provide it. Military families like yours were held to higher standards because your entire social position was based on martial service. Failure to meet conscription requirements wasn't just a legal violation, it was a betrayal of everything your family represented. The preparations for your father's departure began with grim determination. He updated his will, arranged for the management of family affairs during his absence, and spent hours teaching your brother the basic military skills that might keep him alive if something happened to his father. Your mother began the emotional process of preparing for what everyone understood might be a permanent farewell. You watched these preparations with growing desperation and a slowly forming sense of purpose that you didn't immediately recognise. Your father was going to die in a war he was too old to fight because your family had no alternative means of fulfilling their military obligations. Your brother would be left to face the same system that demanded service, regardless of age or preparation. But there was an alternative that no one was discussing because it was so far outside conventional thinking that it seemed impossible rather than merely dangerous. The idea came to you gradually, emerging from the intersection of desperate circumstances and an unconventional education that had taught you to think strategically about military problems. Your family needed to fulfill their conscription obligations. Your father was too old to survive active service. Your brother was too young to be effective. But the army needed soldiers, not specific individuals. They needed people capable of fighting, not men specifically. You had been trained unofficially and partially in the skills that military service required. You could ride horses better than most men, understood military organisation and tactics, and were physically capable of enduring the hardships of campaign life. The only thing preventing you from serving was a social convention that defined military service as exclusively masculine. But social conventions you had learned from your bicultural upbringing were not natural laws. The Tuoba had different ideas about women's capabilities than the Chinese did. In the steppes, women sometimes led tribal military units during emergencies. The current crisis was certainly an emergency, and your family situation was desperate enough to justify extraordinary measures. The plan took shape over several sleepless nights as you considered logistics, risks, and potential consequences. You would take your father's place in the army by disguising yourself as a man, fulfilling your family's military obligations while protecting both your father and brother from service. They couldn't survive. The risks were enormous. Discovery would mean execution for fraud, dishonouring your family, and potentially creating political complications for the dynasty's military organisation. Even if successful, you would be living a lie that would require constant vigilance and could be exposed by injury, illness, or simple bad luck. But the alternatives were worse. Your father would die in a war he couldn't fight. Your family's honour would be destroyed by his inevitable failure. Your brother would face the same impossible choice in a few years when he became eligible for his own military service. You began preparing systematically, treating the challenge like a military operation that required careful planning and precise execution. You studied your father's military documentation, memorising the details of his service record and learning the bureaucratic procedures that governed army enlistment. You practiced altering your appearance, binding your chest, cutting your hair, and modifying your posture and voice to suggest masculine rather than feminine identity. Most importantly, you studied the culture of masculine military identity, learning how men spoke to each other, how they moved, and how they understood concepts like honour, loyalty, and martial prowess. This was the most challenging aspect of your preparation because it required not just physical disguise, but psychological transformation. The night before your father was scheduled to report for duty, you implemented your plan. You cut your hair, put on masculine clothing, and took his military papers and equipment. You left a letter explaining your decision and asking for forgiveness for the deception, then set out for the Army Recruitment Centre before dawn. The letter you left was necessarily brief, but it tried to explain the logic behind your choice. Honourable Father, your daughter goes to war so that you may live and our family's honour may be preserved. I have learned the skills you taught me and will serve with the courage you have shown me. Please forgive my deception and know that it comes from love and duty, not rebellion. Walking through the pre-dawn darkness toward the military compound, you felt the weight of everything you were leaving behind. Your identity as a woman, your planned marriage, your place in your family's normal life, but you also felt something else, a sense of purpose and capability that you had never been allowed to fully express. The Northern Way military recruitment system was both more and less rigorous than you had expected. More rigorous because the army was genuinely desperate for capable soldiers and subjected recruits to immediate physical and mental testing. Less rigorous because the volume of conscripts was so large that individual scrutiny was limited and focused primarily on obvious disqualifications rather than subtle deceptions. You presented yourself as Hua Ping, the dutiful son reporting for military service in place of your aging father. The recruitment officer, a harried veteran processing dozens of new soldiers daily, glanced at your documentation, noted your family's military history, and assigned you to a training cohort without extensive questioning. Military family, he noted approvingly. You'll have advantages over these farm boys who've never seen a sword. Don't let it make you overconfident. Your initial assignment was to a training unit commanded by Captain Wang, a career officer whose approach to preparing civilians for military service was both efficient and brutal. His philosophy was simple. Soldiers who couldn't handle training wouldn't survive combat, so it was better to eliminate the weak early rather than watch them die slowly in actual battles. The physical demands of training were substantial but manageable. Your unconventional education had prepared you better than most recruits for the challenges of military life. You could ride horses, understand basic tactics, and endure physical hardship without complaint. But the social demands were far more complex and dangerous. You had to learn to be masculine in ways that went beyond appearance and voice. You had to participate in the casual conversations through which young men established dominance hierarchies, proved their courage, and demonstrated their understanding of military values. You had to show appropriate interest in topics like warfare, honour, and masculine prowess, while carefully concealing the extent of your actual knowledge. Your bunkmates were a collection of conscripts from various social backgrounds, farmers' sons who had never travelled more than a day's journey from their villages, craftsmen's children who understood discipline but not violence, and merchants' boys who were literate but physically soft. They accepted your presence without suspicion, partly because your military family background explained your competence, and partly because everyone was too focused on their own survival to scrutinise their comrades closely. The training itself was comprehensive and demanding. You learned formation fighting, weapons maintenance, camp construction, and the complex logistics that enabled armies to move across large distances while remaining militarily effective. You practiced with swords, spears and bows until your arms ached, and your hands were permanently calloused. You memorized the signals and procedures that coordinated military units during battle, but perhaps most importantly, you learned to think like a soldier rather than a civilian. You developed the situational awareness that kept people alive in dangerous environments, the quick decision-making that responded effectively to rapidly changing circumstances, and the psychological resilience that functioned under extreme stress. Captain Wang noticed your progress with approval that was both encouraging and dangerous. Recognition meant that your performance was successful, but attention meant scrutiny that could reveal inconsistencies in your disguise. Hua Ping shows promise, he told his sergeants during a training evaluation you weren't supposed to overhear. Good instincts, learns quickly, and doesn't panic under pressure. Military family breeding shows. This assessment led to increased responsibilities and more challenging assignments, which created a positive feedback loop that improved your skills while increasing your visibility within the unit. After 3 months of intensive training, your unit was declared ready for active service and assigned to the Southern Front, where Northern Wei forces were engaged in a series of complex operations against the Liang Dynasty coalition. This was your first exposure to actual warfare rather than training exercises, and the transition was both gradual and shocking. The march south took 2 weeks and covered terrain that became increasingly war-torn as you approached the active combat zone. You passed through villages that had been evacuated, fields that had been burned to prevent enemy use, and refugee camps filled with civilians fleeing the fighting. This was your first exposure to war's impact on non-combatants, and it was sobering in ways that training had not prepared you for. Your unit's initial assignment was rearguard security for supply convoys, moving between established bases and forward positions. This was considered appropriate duty for newly trained soldiers because it involved real military responsibility without the immediate danger of frontline combat. But it also meant exposure to the constant low-level stress of operating in hostile territory, where any group of travellers might include enemy scouts or raiders. The work was tedious and demanding. Long marches while remaining alert for ambushes, careful inspection of terrain that might conceal threats, and the psychological strain of knowing that mistakes could result in lost supplies that other units needed for survival. But it was also educational in ways that no amount of training could replicate. You learned to read landscapes from a military perspective, identifying defensive positions, escape routes, and potential ambush sites. You developed the stamina required for sustained operations under difficult conditions. Most importantly, you learned to function as part of a military unit where individual survival depended on collective competence and mutual trust. Your first encounter with enemy forces came during what should have been a routine convoy escort mission. Intelligence reports had indicated that the route was secure, but the information was outdated and the enemy had moved faster than expected. The attack developed gradually rather than suddenly. Your unit's scouts reported unusual activity in villages ahead of the convoy, then signs of recent military movement, then actual sightings of armed groups that didn't appear to be Northern Wei forces. By the time it became clear that you were moving into an area under enemy control, withdrawal was no longer a simple option. Captain Wang made the decision to continue the mission while taking additional precautions. The convoy was reorganized for defense with combat units positioned to protect the supply wagons while maintaining mobility. Scouts were deployed more extensively to provide early warning of enemy contact. The pace was increased to minimize exposure time in the dangerous area. When the attack came, it was coordinated and professional. Enemy forces had positioned themselves to control the route at multiple points, forcing the convoy to fight its way through prepared positions while protecting vulnerable supply wagons. The battle was not the dramatic confrontation of heroic narratives, but a grinding tactical problem that required disciplined execution of military procedures under extreme stress. You found yourself separated from your usual unit during the fighting, attached to a group tasked with protecting the convoy's left flank. The enemy pressure was intense but not overwhelming. They seemed more interested in capturing supplies than annihilating defenders, which created opportunities for tactical manoeuvring. Your performance during this engagement was competent but not exceptional. You followed orders, maintained formation discipline, and contributed to the collective effort that eventually forced the enemy to withdraw. But you also discovered that combat was both more and less dramatic than you had expected. More dramatic because the immediate danger was genuine and terrifying. Less dramatic because most of the action involved following procedures and making small decisions rather than heroic individual actions. The convoy reached its destination with most supplies intact, and casualty levels within acceptable limits. Your unit's performance was considered satisfactory, and you personally had avoided both injury and discovery. But the experience had been transformative in ways that you didn't immediately understand. Success in your first campaign led to more challenging assignments and increased responsibilities within your unit. The Northern Way military was a meritocracy in the sense that competent soldiers advanced quickly, especially during wartime when losses created opportunities for promotion. Your combination of tactical intelligence, physical capability, and disciplined performance made you a valuable asset that commanders noticed and utilised. Your next assignment was to a reconnaissance unit tasked with gathering intelligence about enemy positions and movements. This was more dangerous than convoy escort duty, but also more intellectually challenging, requiring individual initiative and decision-making rather than simple adherence to established procedures. Reconnaissance work suited your temperament and utilised skills that your unconventional education had developed. You were good at observing details, analysing patterns, and drawing conclusions from incomplete information. You could move quietly through difficult terrain, remain concealed in hostile areas, and accurately report what you had seen. But reconnaissance also required working in small groups or alone, which created both opportunities and risks for maintaining your disguise. Opportunities because fewer people meant less social interaction and reduced chances of exposure through casual conversation. Risks because closer relationships meant more detailed scrutiny and greater likelihood that inconsistencies would be noticed. Your reconnaissance partner was a veteran soldier named Liu Wei, whose experience and competence had kept him alive through multiple campaigns. He was professional, methodical, and remarkably observant, exactly the kind of person most likely to notice details that might reveal your identity. But Liu Wei was also someone who valued competence above all other considerations. As long as you performed your duties effectively and contributed to mission success, he was content to accept you as a capable partner without excessive curiosity about your background or personal characteristics. Working together, you developed an effective partnership that produced accurate intelligence reports and contributed to several successful military operations. Your ability to analyse terrain, assess enemy capabilities, and predict tactical developments earned recognition from senior officers who began requesting your unit for important assignments. This recognition was professionally gratifying, but personally dangerous. Increased visibility meant more interaction with experienced officers who might notice inconsistencies in your disguise. It also meant participation in strategic planning sessions where your opinions were sought and your expertise was valued. The irony was devastating. For the first time in your life, you were treated as an intellectual equal, consulted on important decisions, and valued for your analytical abilities. But this respect was based on a false identity that could be destroyed by a single moment of carelessness or bad luck. You were becoming genuinely skilled at military operations, but you were also becoming trapped by your own success. Each promotion brought new opportunities for discovery. Each recognition created additional pressure to maintain a performance that was becoming increasingly complex and demanding. Your unit's reputation for effective reconnaissance led to assignment to one of the war's most important operations, the siege of Jiankang, the Liang dynasty capital. This was Northern Wei's most ambitious attempt to end the Southern Coalition's resistance by capturing their primary, political, and military centre. Jiankang was a formidable target, protected by multiple walls, extensive fortifications, and a garrison of experienced defenders who understood that the city's fall would effectively end their dynasty's independence. The siege would require months of systematic operations designed to isolate the city, neutralise its defences, and eventually force surrender through starvation or direct assault. Your role in the siege was to provide intelligence about the city's defences, supply lines, and internal conditions. This required operating close to enemy positions, sometimes inside the siege perimeter, gathering information that would inform tactical decisions made by senior commanders. The work was extremely dangerous but intellectually fascinating. You learned to analyse military engineering from both offensive and defensive perspectives, understanding how fortifications were designed and how they could be defeated. You studied the logistics of siege warfare, calculating the resources required to maintain armies in the field while conducting complex operations against prepared positions. But the siege also exposed you to aspects of warfare that training had not addressed. You witnessed the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure designed to force surrender through suffering. You saw refugees fleeing the city carrying whatever possessions they could manage, often leaving behind everything they had built over lifetimes of work. The human cost of large-scale military operations was overwhelming in ways that individual battles had not been. Thousands of people were dying not from combat, but from disease, starvation, and exposure caused by the disruption of normal social and economic systems. The siege was militarily necessary, but morally complex, achieving strategic objectives through methods that caused enormous suffering. Your reconnaissance reports contributed to several successful operations against the city's outer defences, but they also made you complicit in actions that troubled you deeply. You were providing information that enabled more effective attacks against people whose only crime was living in the wrong place during a war they had not chosen. These moral complexities were compounded by the practical challenges of maintaining your disguise during extended operations. The siege environment created unusual social dynamics, where normal military hierarchies were modified by the demands of specialised work. You found yourself working closely with engineers, logistics specialists, and senior officers whose expertise and experience made them potentially dangerous observers of your behaviour. One particularly challenging assignment required you to infiltrate the city itself, disguised as a refugee, to assess internal conditions and defensive preparations. This meant abandoning your military identity temporarily and adopting a civilian persona that required different skills and presented different risks. Entering Jiankang as a refugee was terrifying but revealing. The city was crowded with displaced people from the surrounding countryside, creating a chaotic environment where individual identity was less important than immediate survival. You were able to move through the city relatively freely, observing military preparations and assessing civilian morale. But you also witnessed the impact of the siege from the perspective of its victims rather than its perpetrators. Families were separated, food was scarce, and people were dying from preventable diseases because normal medical care was unavailable. The strategic necessity of the siege was clear from a military perspective, but its human cost was overwhelming from a civilian viewpoint. Your intelligence report from this mission was detailed and useful, contributing to strategic decisions that eventually led to the city's fall. But the experience had changed your understanding of warfare from something heroic and glorious to something necessary but tragic. The fall of Jiankang marks the effective end of the Liang dynasty's resistance and the successful conclusion of the Northern Wei's southern campaign. Your unit's intelligence work had contributed significantly to this victory, and recognition followed in the form of promotions, honours, and assignments to increasingly important responsibilities. You were promoted to the rank of lieutenant and assigned to the staff of General Li Xiaoning, one of the dynasty's most successful commanders and a rising figure in the imperial court. This was an extraordinary opportunity for someone of your apparent background, but it was also extremely dangerous because it meant constant interaction with experienced officers who might notice inconsistencies in your disguise. General Li was a sophisticated military thinker whose approach to warfare emphasized careful planning, detailed intelligence, and precise execution of complex operations. He valued staff officers who could think strategically, analyze information accurately, and communicate effectively with subordinates and superiors. Working for General Li was intellectually stimulating, but socially exhausting. You participated in strategic planning sessions where your opinions were sought and valued. You prepared reports that influenced important military decisions. You interacted with senior officers, court officials, and foreign diplomats who might notice details that revealed your identity. The work itself was fascinating and utilised all the skills your unconventional education had developed. You analysed intelligence reports from multiple sources, prepared briefings on enemy capabilities and intentions, and developed tactical recommendations for complex military operations. For the first time in your life, you were using your intellectual abilities to their full potential, but success created its own problems. Your analytical skills and strategic insights were becoming known throughout the Army's senior leadership. Officers who had never met you knew your reputation and sought your opinions on military matters. This visibility was professionally rewarding, but personally terrifying. The social demands of your position were equally challenging. As a staff officer, you were expected to participate in the informal interactions through which military leaders built relationships and coordinated their efforts. This meant attending dinners, social gatherings, and ceremonial functions where your behaviour would be observed by people skilled at reading social cues and detecting deception. You developed strategies for managing these situations, arriving early and leaving early to minimise exposure time, focusing conversations on professional topics where your expertise was expected, and cultivating a reputation for being serious and dedicated rather than socially engaging. These tactics worked but required constant vigilance and psychological energy. The most dangerous situation was your growing friendship with Captain Zhang Ming, a staff officer whose intelligence and integrity made him someone you genuinely respected and enjoyed working with. Zhang Ming treated you as an intellectual equal, sought your opinions on complex problems, and shared concerns about military policy that he couldn't discuss with subordinates. This friendship was everything you had wanted from male colleagues: respect for your mind, appreciation for your contributions, and genuine intellectual companionship. But it was also based on a deception that could destroy both your career and his if discovered. Zhang Ming began to express curiosity about your background, asking questions about your family, your education, and your experiences before joining the army. These conversations were friendly rather than suspicious, but they required increasingly elaborate explanations and created opportunities for mistakes that could expose your identity. "You have unusual insights for someone so young," he observed, after a particularly successful strategic analysis. Your education must have been exceptional. My father believed that military families should understand more than just weapons and tactics, you replied carefully. He insisted that I study history, literature, and philosophy, as well as martial arts. This explanation was true as far as it went, but it didn't address the more fundamental question of why your analytical approach seemed different from that of other officers. You thought about problems differently, asked different questions, and reached conclusions through methods that reflected your unique background and perspective. Your reputation for strategic intelligence eventually reached the imperial court itself, leading to assignment as a military advisor for court officials responsible for coordinating the empire's defense policies. This was the pinnacle of military achievement for someone of your apparent rank and background, but it was also the most dangerous situation you had ever faced. The Northern Wei Court was a complex political environment where military officers, civilian administrators, Chinese bureaucrats, and Tuoba nobles competed for influence over imperial policy. Your role was to provide military expertise to court officials who needed to understand the practical implications of strategic decisions, but who often lacked direct military experience themselves. The work required you to navigate political complexities that were far more subtle and dangerous than military operations. Court politics involved considerations of personal loyalty, ethnic identity, cultural tradition, and family connection that could override purely rational policy analysis. A recommendation that was militarily sound might be politically unacceptable, while policies that made political sense might be strategically disastrous. Your ethnic background became a significant factor in these political calculations. As someone from a Tuoba military family, you represented the dynasty's nomadic heritage and martial traditions, but you also embodied the cultural synthesis that Emperor Xiaowen was promoting through his Sinicization policies. Different court factions viewed you as either an asset or a liability, depending on their own political positions. The most challenging aspect of court service was the constant scrutiny from people whose survival depended on their ability to read political situations accurately. Court officials were skilled at detecting deception, analysing motivations, and identifying potential threats to their own positions. Your disguise, which had been effective in military environments, was far more vulnerable in this sophisticated political context. You developed new strategies for managing these risks, focusing exclusively on technical military matters, avoiding involvement in political discussions, and cultivating a reputation for being competent but not ambitious. These tactics limited your political exposure, but also constrained your effectiveness as an advisor. The most significant challenge came when Emperor Xuanwu himself requested a personal briefing on the military situation in the Southern Territories. This was an extraordinary honour that represented the highest possible recognition of your expertise, but it was also terrifying because it meant direct interaction with someone whose authority was absolute and whose displeasure could be fatal. The imperial audience took place in a formal setting designed to emphasize the emperor's majesty and the subordinate status of everyone else. You approached the throne with the careful protocol required for such occasions, your heart racing with anxiety that went far beyond normal nervousness about meeting the emperor. Emperor Xuanwu was younger than you had expected, but carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to rule. When he spoke, his voice carried across the audience hall without effort. "Lieutenant Hua Ping," he said, reading from notes prepared by his advisors, "your analysis of southern military capabilities has been valuable to our strategic planning. I am told that your insights reflect both military competence and scholarly understanding." You knelt as protocol demanded, your head bowed both in respect and to hide your face from too close examination. I am honoured by your Majesty's recognition. I serve only to preserve the dynasty and protect the realm." "Rise," the Emperor commanded. "Explain to me the current military balance in the Southern Territories." What followed was perhaps the most terrifying and exhilarating 20 minutes of your life. You provided a comprehensive analysis of enemy capabilities, strategic options, and recommended policies for consolidating Northern Wei control over recently conquered territories. The Emperor listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and occasionally challenged your assumptions in ways that demonstrated his own understanding of military affairs. Throughout the audience, you were acutely aware that you were standing before the most powerful person in the known world, while maintaining a deception that would mean death if discovered. But you were also fulfilling a role that utilised all your capabilities and contributed to decisions that would affect millions of people. The Emperor's final comment was both encouraging and ominous. "Your advice is sound, and your loyalty evident. We will remember your service to the dynasty." Imperial memory could be either a blessing or a curse, depending on future circumstances. Your successful audience with Emperor Xuanwu led to permanent assignment as a strategic advisor, with responsibilities that included analysing intelligence reports, preparing policy recommendations, and briefing senior officials on military developments throughout the empire. This was the kind of position that career military officers spent decades hoping to achieve. But for you, it represented a trap that was becoming increasingly difficult to escape. The work itself was intellectually satisfying and genuinely important. You were contributing to strategic decisions that affected the security and prosperity of millions of people. Your analysis influenced policies on military organisation, defensive strategy, and the integration of conquered territories into the imperial administrative system. For the first time in your life, you were using your capabilities to their full potential and making a meaningful contribution to something larger than your own survival. But success created new problems that were more complex and dangerous than the original challenges of maintaining your disguise. Your reputation for strategic insight had spread throughout the military hierarchy and the imperial court. Officials who had never met you knew your work and sought your opinions on policy matters. This visibility was professionally rewarding but personally terrifying. More problematically, your extended service was beginning to raise questions about your personal life that were becoming difficult to answer. Career military officers were expected to marry, establish families, and demonstrate the personal stability that came from domestic responsibilities. Your apparent lack of interest in marriage was starting to seem unusual rather than simply dedicated. General Li Xiaoning, your immediate superior, began expressing concern about your personal situation during routine performance evaluations. "You've served with distinction for 5 years," he observed during one such conversation. "Your strategic abilities are exceptional and your loyalty is unquestioned. But a man of your accomplishments should be thinking about marriage and family responsibilities." "I prefer to focus on military service," you replied carefully. "Personal attachments might compromise my effectiveness." That's admirable dedication, but it's also unusual. Most officers find that family responsibilities enhance rather than diminish their commitment to service. Marriage provides stability and motivation that benefit military performance. These conversations were becoming more frequent and more pointed. The Army's senior leadership was genuinely concerned about your welfare, but their concern was creating pressure to make personal choices that were impossible given your actual identity. The social expectations of your apparent position were also becoming more complex. As a successful officer, you were expected to participate in the informal networks through which military leaders coordinated their activities and built the relationships that shaped policy decisions. This meant attending social gatherings, developing friendships with colleagues, and engaging in the kind of personal interactions that could reveal inconsistencies in your disguise. You found yourself walking an increasingly narrow line between the professional engagement that your position required and the personal exposure that could destroy everything you had built. Every conversation was a potential trap where a careless word or inappropriate response could raise questions about your identity. The psychological strain was enormous, and getting worse. You had been living a false identity for years, constantly vigilant about maintaining a performance that had become second nature but was never unconscious. The mental energy required for this constant deception was exhausting in ways that physical hardship had never been. The crisis that you had always known might come began subtly, with small inconsistencies that gradually attracted attention from people whose job it was to notice details that didn't fit expected patterns. The imperial court employed officials whose responsibility was to investigate irregularities in military records, and your file had begun to show discrepancies that warranted closer examination. The problem wasn't that anyone suspected you were a woman. That possibility was so far outside conventional thinking that it rarely occurred to investigators. The problem was that your service record contained elements that didn't align with typical patterns for officers of your apparent background and experience. Your analytical abilities were unusually sophisticated for someone who had supposedly received only basic military education. Your strategic insights reflected knowledge of classical texts and philosophical approaches that were uncommon among career soldiers. Your personal behaviour suggested cultural influences that didn't match your stated family background. The investigation began as a routine verification of service records designed to identify potential security risks or administrative errors. Court officials wanted to ensure that people in sensitive positions were who they claimed to be, and that their loyalty to the dynasty was genuine and uncomplicated by conflicting obligations. Investigator Chen Wei was assigned to review your file and resolve the discrepancies that had been identified during routine security assessments. Chen Wei was a professional bureaucrat whose career was built on meticulous attention to detail and systematic analysis of complex information. He approached your case with the same methodical thoroughness that he applied to all security investigations. The investigation process was thorough, but initially non-threatening. Chen Wei reviewed your service records, interviewed colleagues about your performance and behaviour, and examined the documentation that supported your identity and background. Most of this investigation was conducted without your knowledge, following standard procedures for security reviews. But Chen Wei was also skilled at identifying patterns that suggested deception or concealment. Your behaviour exhibited subtle characteristics that were unusual for someone of your apparent background. You were more educated than expected, more culturally sophisticated than typical for military families, and more careful about personal privacy than normal for career soldiers. Lieutenant Hua Ping presents some interesting anomalies, Chen Wei reported to his superiors. His military performance is exceptional, and his loyalty appears genuine, but there are aspects of his background that warrant additional investigation. The additional investigation involved more direct examination of your personal behaviour and social interactions. Chen Wei began attending functions where you were present, observing your conduct and listening to your conversations. He also initiated casual contact, presenting himself as a court official interested in military affairs and seeking your opinions on strategic matters. These interactions were terrifying because Chen Wei was skilled at eliciting information through seemingly innocent conversations. He asked questions about your family, your education, and your experiences in ways that seemed friendly but were actually designed to test the consistency of your story and identify potential deceptions. Your insights into classical strategy are impressive, he observed during one such conversation. Your father must have provided an exceptional education for a military family. He believed that effective officers needed to understand more than just tactics, you replied, using the explanation that had served you well in previous similar situations. Wise approach. Which classical text did he emphasize? This was exactly the kind of detailed questioning that could expose inconsistencies in your story. You had studied classical military texts, but your education had been broader and more sophisticated than what you claimed to have received. Answering accurately might reveal knowledge that was inconsistent with your stated background, while answering inaccurately might expose ignorance that contradicted your demonstrated capabilities. You navigated the conversation carefully, providing answers that were truthful but incomplete, demonstrating knowledge without revealing its full extent. But each such interaction was a test that could expose your deception through a single mistake or moment of carelessness. Chen Wei's investigation was creating pressure that affected every aspect of your daily life. You were constantly aware that your behaviour was being observed and analysed by someone skilled at detecting deception. Every conversation, every decision, every casual interaction was potentially significant evidence in an investigation that could destroy everything you had built. The investigation was also attracting attention from other officials who had their own reasons for scrutinising your background and position. Court politics involved complex networks of alliance and opposition, and your success had inevitably created both supporters and rivals who had interests in either protecting or undermining your position. Some officials saw you as a valuable asset whose expertise contributed to imperial policy effectiveness. They had invested political capital in supporting your advancement and would be embarrassed if you proved to be a security risk or fraudulent identity. These supporters provided protection from some forms of scrutiny, but they also created pressure to maintain the high performance levels that justified their confidence. Other officials viewed your rapid advancement as evidence of favouritism or as a threat to their own positions within the imperial hierarchy. These rivals were interested in finding flaws in your background that could be used to discredit your influence and remove you from competition for important assignments. The political dynamics created a situation where you were simultaneously protected and threatened, valued and vulnerable. Your competence was your greatest asset, but it was also the source of the attention that made discovery more likely. The most immediate pressure came from renewed expectations about your personal life. General Li Xiaoning was becoming increasingly insistent that you should marry and establish the family relationships that were considered normal for officers of your rank and position. "I've identified several suitable candidates," he announced during a private meeting. "Daughters of respectable military families who would understand the demands of army life. Marriage would enhance your social position and demonstrate the personal stability that the court values in senior officers." This pressure was becoming impossible to deflect without arousing suspicion. Continued refusal to consider marriage was beginning to seem abnormal rather than simply dedicated, but accepting arranged introductions would create situations where maintaining your disguise would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. You attempted to buy time by expressing concern about your military obligations and the uncertainty of wartime service. "Perhaps after the current campaign is concluded," you suggested, "I would prefer to focus entirely on military duties while active operations continue." But the southern campaign was effectively over, with only minor operations required to consolidate northern Wei control over conquered territories. The excuse was becoming less credible as the strategic situation stabilized. Meanwhile, Chen Wei's investigation was becoming more focused and intrusive. He had apparently identified specific aspects of your background that he wanted to examine more closely, and his questioning was becoming more pointed and difficult to deflect. "Your military records indicate service in reconnaissance units," he observed during one conversation. "That must have required extensive travel and exposure to different regional cultures. This was dangerous territory because reconnaissance service had indeed exposed you to diverse experiences that had influenced your perspectives and knowledge. But discussing these experiences in detail might reveal insights or information that were inconsistent with your stated background. Reconnaissance work teaches you to observe and adapt, you replied carefully. Different regions have different customs and challenges. Indeed, which regions did you find most instructive? Each answer led to follow-up questions that required increasingly detailed explanations. Chen Wei was systematically mapping your claimed experiences and comparing them with documented military operations, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate deception or false claims. The investigation was also creating social pressure within your professional relationships. Colleagues were beginning to notice that you were being scrutinized by court officials, and they were naturally curious about the reasons for this attention. Chen Wei seems very interested in your background, Captain Jiang Ming observed. Is there some special assignment under consideration? Jiang Ming's question was friendly rather than suspicious, but it indicated that your situation was becoming visible to people whose goodwill you valued and whose suspicion could be dangerous. The crisis that ended your military career came suddenly, triggered by a convergence of circumstances that made continued deception impossible. Chen Wei's investigation had identified inconsistencies in your documentation that required direct verification. A new military assignment would expose you to medical examination that would reveal your identity, and the political pressure for you to marry had reached a point where continued refusal was no longer credible. The immediate catalyst was an order assigning you to a diplomatic mission to the Southern Territories, where you would serve as military advisor to officials negotiating the integration of conquered territories into the imperial administrative system. This was an important assignment that reflected confidence in your abilities, but it also required comprehensive medical certification to ensure that you could handle the physical demands of extended travel and potential combat situations. Military physicians were thorough in their examinations of officers assigned to important missions. The medical review would include physical inspection that would immediately reveal your biological identity, making continued deception impossible. At the same time, Chen Wei had requested permission to interview your family members as part of his background investigation. He wanted to verify details about your upbringing and education by speaking directly with people who had known you before your military service. This would inevitably expose the fact that Hua Ping had never existed, that the family's only child was a daughter who had disappeared years earlier. The convergence of these pressures created a situation where discovery was inevitable within days rather than weeks or months. You had to choose between attempting to maintain your deception through increasingly elaborate lies that would eventually be exposed, or ending the masquerade on your own terms. The decision to reveal your identity was both terrifying and liberating. You had been living a false life for years, constantly vigilant about maintaining a performance that had become psychologically exhausting. The prospect of ending the deception was frightening because of the potential consequences, but it was also appealing because it would end the constant stress of hiding your true identity. You chose to confess to General Li Xiaoning, the officer who had been most supportive of your career and who might be most likely to understand the motivations behind your deception. The conversation took place in his private office, where you could speak freely without being overheard by other officials. General, you began carefully, I need to inform you of something that will affect my ability to continue serving in my current position. Li Xiaoning listened with growing amazement as you explained the truth about your identity, your family situation, and the circumstances that had led to your decision to impersonate a male soldier. His expression progressed through confusion, surprise, and finally a kind of professional respect for the audacity and effectiveness of your deception. "How long have you been serving under false identity?" he asked. "5 years, sir." "And in all that time no one suspected?" "No one, sir." He was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of what you had told him. Your confession created professional problems for him, as well as personal ones for you. He had recommended you for promotion, relied on your advice for important decisions, and supported your advancement within the military hierarchy. Your deception made him appear either incompetent or complicit. But Li Xiaoning was also a practical man who valued competence above social conventions. Your military service had been exemplary regardless of your gender, and your strategic insights had contributed to successful operations that had saved lives and advanced imperial interests. "What do you want me to do with this information?" he asked finally. "I leave that to your judgment, sir. I wanted you to hear the truth from me rather than discovering it through the official investigation." Chen Wei's investigation would have exposed this eventually. "Yes, sir, within days." Li Xiaoning nodded slowly, understanding the impossible position you had found yourself in. "You realize that military law is clear about the penalties for impersonating a soldier?" "Yes, sir. And you understand that this revelation will create significant complications for everyone who has supported your career?" "Yes, sir. I apologize for the difficulties my deception will cause." What happened next would determine not only your fate, but also the fate of everyone who had been associated with your military service. General Li Xiaoning's response to your confession was more nuanced and strategic than you had expected. Rather than immediately reporting your deception to higher authorities, he chose to manage the situation in a way that would minimize damage to both your reputation and his own position within the military hierarchy. "Your service record is exemplary," he said after considering the situation carefully. "Your strategic insights have contributed to successful operations that saved lives and advanced imperial interests. The fact that these contributions came from someone other than who we thought is irregularly relevant." His solution was characteristically practical. Rather than exposing your deception through official channels, he would arrange for your quiet retirement from military service on medical grounds. You would be honourably discharged for health reasons that prevented continued active duty, preserving both your reputation and the reputations of officers who had supported your advancement. This approach protected everyone involved while acknowledging the reality that your continued service was impossible once your identity was known. It also avoided the political complications that would arise from a public revelation that the military hierarchy had been deceived for years by someone they had promoted and relied upon for important decisions. "Chen Wei's investigation will be redirected," Li Xiaoning explained. "We'll provide documentation that satisfies his concerns without revealing information that would create unnecessary complications." The transition from military service to civilian life was managed with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized your military career. Your discharge was processed quietly, with sufficient documentation to satisfy bureaucratic requirements, but without the public attention that would attract unwanted scrutiny. You returned to your family's home after an absence of 5 years, carrying memories of experiences that no woman of your generation had ever had, and knowledge that few people of any gender possessed. Your parents' reaction to your return was complex, combining relief at your survival with concern about the social implications of what you had done. Your father, now genuinely elderly and grateful that his military obligations had been fulfilled without requiring his own service, expressed pride in your accomplishments, even while acknowledging the unconventional nature of your choices. "You served with honour," he said simply. "You preserved the family's reputation and contributed to the dynasty's success. That you did so as a woman rather than as a man is unprecedented but not dishonourable." Your mother's response was more ambivalent. She was grateful for your survival and proud of your achievements, but she was also concerned about the practical implications of your situation. You are now a woman in her 20s with no husband, no conventional domestic skills, and a background that made you unsuitable for normal marriage arrangements. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Your experiences have prepared you for a life that women are not allowed to live." This was the fundamental problem that your military service had created. You had spent 5 years developing capabilities and knowledge that were valuable in military and administrative contexts, but which were essentially useless in the domestic sphere where women were expected to function. You had become someone who could analyse strategic situations, coordinate complex operations, and advise senior officials on military policy. But you were still expected to be someone who could manage a household, raise children, and subordinate yourself to masculine authority in all important decisions. The contradiction was irreconcilable within conventional social structures. Your reintegration into civilian life required creating a new identity that incorporated the knowledge and experiences of your military service while conforming to social expectations for women of your background and age. This was perhaps more challenging than maintaining your original deception, because it required being simultaneously honest about your capabilities and discreet about their origins. The practical challenges were immediate and complex. You were now a woman with extensive knowledge of military affairs, strategic planning, and administrative procedures, but you were expected to function in a social role that had no place for such expertise. Your education was far more extensive than what was considered appropriate for women, and your experiences were completely outside the range of what women were allowed to have. Your family solution was to present you as someone whose extended absence had been due to caring for distant relatives, a socially acceptable explanation that accounted for your time away without revealing the true nature of your activities. This story required careful coordination to ensure that details were consistent and that no one asked questions that might expose inconsistencies. But even with a plausible cover story, your reintegration into feminine social roles was difficult. You had spent 5 years thinking and acting like a military officer, making important decisions and taking responsibility for outcomes that affected many people. Returning to a social position where your opinions were irrelevant and your capabilities were unwanted was psychologically challenging. The marriage question remained problematic. You were now in your mid-20s, which was considered quite late for a first marriage, and your extended absence required explanations that potential suitors and their families found unsatisfying. Your apparent lack of domestic skills and your unusual breadth of knowledge created additional complications for matchmaking efforts. Most importantly, your experiences had changed your understanding of what you wanted from life in ways that made conventional marriage arrangements unappealing. You had experienced intellectual equality, professional respect, and meaningful work. The prospect of subordinating yourself to a husband who would neither value your capabilities nor allow you to use them was deeply unattractive. Your solution was to gradually establish yourself as an informal advisor to military families in your region. Your knowledge of army life, understanding of military procedures, and connections to active duty officers made you valuable to families dealing with conscription, military careers, and the practical challenges of supporting relatives in service. This work allowed you to use your expertise in socially acceptable ways. You could advise families about military matters without claiming inappropriate authority, and you could maintain connections to the military community without violating gender expectations about women's roles. The arrangement was irregular but sustainable. You provided valuable services that people needed, and you received social acceptance and modest financial support in return. Most importantly, You found a way to use your capabilities without directly challenging the social conventions that made your military service impossible to acknowledge publicly. Your military service became family legend rather than historical record, preserved in private memory but absent from official accounts of the campaigns you had participated in. This was both frustrating and necessary. Frustrating because your contributions were significant and deserving of recognition. Necessary because public acknowledgement would create political complications for everyone involved. The story that emerged within your family emphasized duty, sacrifice, and devotion to honor, rather than individual heroism or gender transgression. You had served your family's obligations and preserved their reputation through extraordinary personal sacrifice. The fact that this service required deception was treated as regrettable but necessary given the circumstances. This framing allowed your family to take pride in your achievements while avoiding the social disapproval that would have followed public knowledge of your deception. It also provided a narrative that could be shared with trusted friends and relatives without challenging fundamental assumptions about gender roles and social order. But the private celebration of your service was complicated by the broader social implications of what you had done. Your success demonstrated that women could perform military duties effectively if given the opportunity, but it also proved that such opportunities could only be obtained through deception and maintained through constant vigilance. The lesson was ambiguous. You had proven that women could serve as soldiers, but you had also demonstrated that such service was only possible by pretending to be men. This suggested both the potential for expanded women's roles and the practical impossibility of achieving such expansion within existing social structures. Your father began including your story in the military traditions he shared with younger family members, but always with careful emphasis on the exceptional circumstances that had made your service necessary and the unique family obligations that had justified your deception. Sometimes duty requires actions that are irregular but honourable, he would explain. Your aunt served our family and our dynasty with courage and skill. That she did so in ways that were unprecedented does not diminish the honour of her service. These family stories preserved memory of your achievements while situating them within acceptable frameworks of understanding. You were celebrated as someone who had fulfilled family obligations through extraordinary sacrifice, not as someone who had challenged fundamental assumptions about women's capabilities. This careful framing was both protective and limiting. It allowed your family to acknowledge your service without suffering social consequences, but it also prevented your example from inspiring broader changes in social expectations about women's roles. Your military service left traces in official records that would puzzle historians for centuries, but these traces were fragmentary and ambiguous rather than comprehensive and clear. The careful management of your departure from military service had ensured that most documentation was either destroyed or modified to eliminate references that might raise uncomfortable questions. The records that survived included commendations for strategic analysis, reports of successful reconnaissance missions, and recommendations for advancement that praised your intelligence and dedication. But these documents identified you as Lieutenant Hua Ping, a male officer whose subsequent disappearance from military records was attributed to medical retirement. Historians studying Northern Wei military organisation would occasionally notice inconsistencies in personnel records from your period of service, but these discrepancies were minor enough to be attributed to administrative errors rather than systematic deception. The possibility that a woman had served successfully as a military officer for 5 years was so far outside historical expectations that it was rarely considered as an explanation for irregular documentation. Your story survived primarily in oral traditions rather than written records, passed down through family networks and military communities as an example of extraordinary service under exceptional circumstances. These oral accounts preserved the essential facts of your service while adapting details to make them more acceptable to contemporary audiences. Over time, these stories began to acquire legendary characteristics that emphasized dramatic moments and heroic actions rather than the daily realities of maintaining a false identity under constant scrutiny. The psychological challenges of your deception, the intellectual contributions of your strategic analysis, and the complex motivations behind your decisions were simplified into narratives of patriotic duty and family loyalty. The legendary versions of your story were more inspiring but less accurate than the historical reality. They presented your service as a romantic adventure rather than a desperate expedient, and they emphasized dramatic combat scenes rather than the careful intelligence work that had been your primary contribution to military operations. These legendary accounts served important cultural functions by providing examples of extraordinary dedication to family and dynasty, but they also obscured the real lessons of your experience about women's capabilities and the social restrictions that prevented these capabilities from being utilized openly. The historical Mulan became a symbol of filial piety and patriotic service, but this symbolic role overshadowed the more complex reality of someone who had navigated impossible social contradictions through intelligence, courage, and sustained deception. As you aged and gained perspective on your experiences, you came to understand your life as both extraordinary and representative. Extraordinary in its specific circumstances and achievements. Representative in its demonstration of the constraints and possibilities that shaped women's lives in your historical period. Your military service had been successful because you possessed capabilities that were valued in military contexts but were not supposed to exist in women. Your strategic intelligence, physical courage, and psychological resilience were exactly the qualities that effective soldiers needed, but they were also qualities that social conventions insisted women could not possess. The contradiction was fundamental rather than superficial. Society needed the capabilities that you and other women possessed, but it also needed to maintain gender hierarchies that defined women as incapable of providing these capabilities. Your success threatened these hierarchies not because you challenged them directly, but because you demonstrated their arbitrariness. Your service proved that women could function effectively in roles defined as masculine, but it also proved that such effectiveness could only be achieved through deception that was psychologically costly and socially dangerous. The lesson was that women's exclusion from military and political roles was based on convention rather than necessity, but it was also that challenging these conventions required personal sacrifices that few people could sustain. Looking back on your experiences, you understood that your greatest achievement was not any particular military success, but rather the demonstration that women's supposed limitations were social constructions rather than natural laws. You had shown that women could think strategically, act courageously, and lead effectively when given opportunities to do so. But you also understood that individual achievement could not transform social structures that were maintained by powerful interests and deep cultural assumptions. Your success had been possible because it remained hidden. Public knowledge of women's military capabilities would have threatened established hierarchies and generated responses designed to prevent such achievements in the future. The personal cost of your deception had been enormous. You had spent years denying fundamental aspects of your identity, constantly vigilant about maintaining a performance that became increasingly complex and demanding. The psychological strain had been manageable during your military service because the work itself was engaging and meaningful, but the long-term effects were significant. You had become someone who understood both masculine and feminine social roles from the inside, but who belonged fully to neither. Your experiences had given you unique insights into the arbitrary nature of gender distinctions, but they had also made it difficult to function comfortably within conventional social expectations. In your later years, you found satisfaction in serving as an informal advisor to other women facing impossible choices between family obligations and personal capabilities. Your experiences had taught you that social limitations could sometimes be circumvented through careful planning and sustained effort, but they had also taught you that such circumvention required sacrifices that not everyone could or should make. Your legacy was complex. You had demonstrated women's capabilities while also proving the social impossibility of acknowledging these capabilities openly. You had served your family and your dynasty with distinction, but you had done so by denying your own identity and living a lie that was both necessary and corrosive. The story of your life raised questions about social organisation, gender roles, and individual identity that your society was not prepared to answer. These questions would persist long after your death, inspiring both admiration for your achievements and discomfort with their implications. In the end, you had lived a life that was both successful and tragic. Successful because you had accomplished extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. Tragic because you had been forced to deny fundamental aspects of yourself in order to achieve anything at all. And there, in that tension between achievement and concealment, between capability and constraint, between individual potential and social limitation, lay the true story of your life as Mulan. A story that was far more complex and meaningful than the legends that would eventually remember your name. But remember, it attached to a tale that bore only passing resemblance to the reality of what you had actually lived through. Your life demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of individual action within restrictive social systems. You had proven that such systems could be navigated through intelligence and determination, but you had also shown that navigation was not the same as transformation. The structures that had made your deception necessary remained intact, ready to impose the same constraints on future generations of women who possessed capabilities that society preferred to deny. And with that understanding, we can rest, knowing that history is always more complex than legends, that individual lives contain multitudes that official records rarely preserve, and that the real stories of how people navigate impossible circumstances are often more inspiring than the simplified tales that survive in popular memory. Sleep well, knowing that even in the most restrictive societies, human ingenuity and determination can find ways to serve important purposes, even when doing so requires extraordinary personal sacrifice and the kind of sustained courage that history rarely recognizes or rewards.